Back with a thud to London, to the school run, to the rush hour traffic, to the rain, the wind. Actually, it's not too cold, so at least we shouldn't complain about that. But a good flight back in a direct flight from Mexico City after the race, British Airways. Bit cramped, as you can imagine, but nice to be able to just leave and get back to reality in some ways, although the afterglow of the Mexican Grand Prix still lingers. It was definitely a weekend to remember, a red letter race, I think, for Formula One, in not necessarily the race itself, although I quite enjoyed the race. I thought there was never a moment when I thought, whoa, this is boring. And most of the time I thought this is quite interesting. But for the most part, it was the ancillaries. It was all the stuff around it, the pre-game, the post-game, that made it such a nice event. And as I said in a previous video, if you're going to have a race after the championships have been clinched, after the second championships have been clinched, as it was in Austin, no better race to have than Mexico coming back onto the Grand Prix calendar for the first time since 1992. It was, so many things to talk about when I look back at that race day now. The nicest thing, from my perspective, was that Nigel Mansell did get to do a parade lap in an open car, and he did it next to Bernie. I went to see Bernie on the Saturday and said, wouldn't it be nice if Nigel, as the ambassador for the race and as the winner of the last race to be held here in Mexico, and as the guy that made history at Peraltada, as he's all here and looking good, wouldn't it be nice to have him out there in front of the crowds? And Bernie said, what a great idea, let's do it. So that was nice. And here's a shot of him just after that. He's pretty pumped up, Nigel. It takes, obviously he loves it still, but he's very low key in some ways. I've showed in a previous video a shot of Nigel just having lunch quietly on his own in the media centre and minding his own business, really, and not playing up the role as much as perhaps we would have imagined he would have played up the role as the race's ambassador 15 years ago if he'd been given this position. He did it in a very good way, I think, and he really loved it. The crowd took to him as well, and as he said, I said to him, I actually interviewed him for TV after the parade lap and said, how do you feel about the Peraltada no longer being the corner that it was? And he said, well, if it's got to change because of safety and because of 2015 F1 normality, this is the way to do it. And actually to have the corner named after him that will define the winner of the race, i.e. whoever comes out of that corner first on the last lap will be the winner. He liked that as well. So that was excellent. And that whole pre-race glow began with, there was a nice little Formula 4 race, locals there, and I felt a bit sorry for them because not too many people took a lot of interest in it, but those Formula 4 cars looked great on the circuit, even if they obviously were a bit breathless on the straight. And the inevitable shunt brought out a safety car for that. But it really began with the historic Masters race, the second one, but the second one was held on race morning. I was lucky enough to be doing the interviews on the podium for that, so I got a feel for the atmosphere and the podium and what it looked like to be on the podium and the view from the podium and the crowd, and it was just building, the atmosphere was just building up with every passing minute, really. And those guys, I've got to say, in the Masters race, it's very easy these days to be so inside motor racing that you disapprove of things like historic Masters Formula One because the cars aren't identical. They've got a lot more gizmos on them now than they ever had back in 1976. But nonetheless, that was a March 761 that was out there. That was a Lotus 91. That was an Ensign. But all of them came from an era that Mexico missed, i.e. anything after 1970, before 1986. So that entire era was there on display, which was, no real Ferraris there, but there were a lot of good Cosworth cars there. And it was lovely to see them. It was the music that made the pre-game show ultimately, though, because we don't normally see it all choreographed in that way. And it began as early as 8 o'clock in the morning when the drivers and the Paddock Club guests would be arriving at the circuit, more or less in the same area, in the parapet overlooking that entrance area, there were the mariachis playing away. And so you couldn't avoid it. And it became just an integral part of the whole day. And music to me is always something that blends very well with motor racing. And I've often thought that it's very underplayed. It tends, I think most directors tend towards sort of fairly upbeat music when they associate it with Formula One. But most of the time, in my view, the racing lends itself to quite emotional, softer music. And I think I've said this years ago probably, but I'll repeat it, that the first time I ever saw Jackie Stewart close up was at Warwick Farm in 1966. And it was after the race. The sun was going down. He was still in his Dunlop overalls, although I think he was in his Dunlop, light blue Dunlop pants, but he had a polo shirt on from memory, and he was eating a pear. I'll never forget that. He was eating a pear the way most of us eat an apple. I thought that was quite interesting. Quite a lot of juice going everywhere. And he walked off to the loo, and I wanted to go to the loo as well. And we were both there, and I thought, wow, that's Jackie Stewart. But in the background on the PA, they were playing the Beatles' The Long and Winding Road. And whenever I hear that song, I always think of Jackie Stewart and that long winding road ahead of his career that was there at that moment. That was the whole pages that were there to be written. And that's how I always see it. In the same way, the first song that was ever played immediately after the news that I heard of Jim Clark's fatal accident in '68 was Peter Southstead singing "Where Do You Go To My Lovely?" And that was, whenever I hear that, obviously I always think of Jimmy. Anyway, that's just a little aside. But the mariachis made the Mexican Grand Prix in many ways for me, because you don't have to like mariachi music. It was the fact that it was Mexican culture and texture. That was what it was all about. And when the drivers' parade was on, and Checo Perez was being interviewed on the big screens by Giselle of Mexican TV, who did a great job, I think. She's wonderful. And when the mariachis were still playing, and then when Checo came back after the drivers' parade and threw the caps into the crowd, the mariachis built up their music. The whole thing was brilliantly done, and I loved it. But then I've always loved that sort of thing. I've loved that the way the drivers look on parade laps. And I'm so pleased that they were on individual classic cars, and here you can see some of them, because being herded together on a flat top is just not the same thing. And the crowd obviously have favourites, and it's nice for the drivers and for the crowd to have that one-on-one visibility, I think. So that was wonderful. And then on top of all that, November the 1st. I mean, what were the odds when Bernie sat down to do the 2015 calendar and Mexico took the date a week after the US Grand Prix, which was 2 weeks after the Russian Grand Prix? What were the odds of November the 1st being a part of that weekend? And November the 1st, of course, was the day on which Ricardo Rodriguez lost his life in the '62 Mexican Grand Prix at the Paratalda in qualifying. What were the odds of that? And that added, of course, a new dimension to the feel and the emotion of the morning and of the day. This was one of the screen grabs that went up in the media center, and excellent. I thought that we're still remembering the Rodriguez brothers, and we can do it in this way. And Ricardo, of course, lost his life when he was 20. Pedro was killed in 1971. And I think it's rare and it's unusual for Formula One's, for a circuit to be so tied to the memory of drivers. Brazil, the next one, is also to Jose Carlos Pache, but not quite as much is made of Pache, I think, in Brazil as is made of the Rodriguez in Mexico. So that added to it. And the crowds, as I say, I was standing on the podium there, and the grandstands were probably 2/3 full at that point, quite early in the morning for the Masters race. But the crowds were just incredible. Bear in mind, there was no public car parking in Mexico at the circuit, presumably for logistics and air pollution reasons, because Mexico's gridlocked at the best of times. And so basically they had the face of a compass, and most of the angles were covered by huge car park lots on the edge of the compass ring, and buses bringing the fans in from all parts of Mexico City, north, south, east, and west. And from what I gather, it was long and painstaking. There was sometimes a 2-hour queue to get onto the bus or to get into a bus, and then beyond that, a 2-hour journey. I know Diego Moreno, my friend, who was an FIA official at the Mexican Grand Prix, assistant to the FIA technical people, had to get a 3:30 wake-up call. Good luck, Diego. Well done for going through all that. But they were all there, and there was no standing capability in Mexico. The only way you could watch the Grand Prix was in a grandstand seat. And there must have been at least 100,000, for sure over 100,000 grandstand seats there, and they were all taken. And it was very, very impressive. There were horror stories before the race that a lot of the tickets had been bought by touts and that they'd been sold on at massive premiums. Maybe they were, but even if they were, a lot of people were buying them. And I know that they were going, just in the build-up to the race, like 4 days before the race, and I know this because I was trying to help some friends get some grandstand seats, they were going for about $1,000 US per seat. And for Mexico, when you think of the economy there, over 100,000 sold. It's pretty impressive. And it was actually a feel-good race as well, because when you work in Formula One and you go to a lot of the races, you do tend to, it's inevitable that people are going to be moaning about this or that, and the sport's going downhill, and this is about to collapse, and that's about to collapse. And it was nice. It's been nice for me to go to Russia, certainly, and then on to Mexico via the United States, where you can really feel that Formula One still has a massive amount of future. And that was never clearer, I think, than in Mexico City. One of the other nice things about Mexico, and again I mentioned this in passing, was the number of people, interesting people you'd meet in the paddock. Normally you'd say that about the US Grand Prix as well, but because of the weather it was much more difficult this year. But here's a shot of Hector Abaque. I hadn't seen Hector since he raced the Hector Abaque Formula One car with his team manager, excellent team manager Peter Reinhardt. And Hector hasn't changed much, just the same guy. He's in he's in the property world these days, and specializes in boutique tourist resorts. But yeah, Hector was in good form. Joe Ramirez was just brilliant to see and to have around all weekend. And yeah, just lovely people in general, up and down. There's a great atmosphere, and wherever you went, there was always something interesting to do. And quite often when I had a slight lull, a 10-minute break between this or that, I'd just go down to the paddock, and immediately you'd bump into somebody and find half an hour had passed and you were late for the next meeting. My final reiteration is, isn't it amazing that this circuit has seen Formula One through 3 different perspectives, radically different perspectives. The 60s, which in my mind was all in black and white, but it was the 1.5 litre formula and the beginning of the 3 litre formula. Some amazing championship deciders, some amazing wins, Richie Ginther, John Surtees in the Cooper Maserati, if you please. And then nothing until 1986, when Gerhard Berger won his first race, and suddenly Formula One was full of colourful sponsors like Benetton and Marlboro. And that went through to 92, to the Williams wins of 91 and 92, FW14B, probably the most technically advanced Formula One car that will ever race. And then it suddenly stopped again, and then Formula One reappeared in that country in its current form with these hybrid engines and these cars, these enormous cars, looking again completely different names, different colours. But, that's Mexico, and that's what it's brought to the sport, and long may it continue.